So I'm going to sit down. And hopefully Professor Brotherton, there's his voice, and there's his face, and here comes the rest of him. Come sit with me, David.
Final thing.
Here. So, first a reminder to the panelists that we have to use our microphones for the sake of the video recording, so that even though we all have good, strong teaching voices, we have to use our microphones. I'm not going to read the biography of everybody present, but I will tell you a little bit about each one. We have Melinda Powers from the Department of English, who also has a background in theater and performance. And then we have Professor David Brotherton, who's the chair of sociology. Karen Malke, who teaches with communication and theater arts, a playwright also. Shicha Raghavan, who is in the Department of Psychology and runs some graduate program. And she is also, important to me, an opera singer, and quite a good one. And Lucia Trimber. I always want to say Trimber, and then I think about trees.
I know. So did everybody in elementary school.
I'm sorry. Go back, roll the tape back. And she teaches in the Department of Sociology, and I'm Seth Bauman, the chair of Communication and Theater Arts. Our purpose here today may be diverted by your interests, because what I'm thinking about is we've just been through 2 days of fascinating presentations on the theme of performance and justice with a very wide-ranging set of approaches to this theme, all of which I think work in the classroom. I'm wondering, and I have my own ideas, but I'm wondering 2 things. First of all, how each one of us might approach that in the classroom were we to teach such a course. If we have a course called Performance and Justice at John Jay College, that's why all the panelists are from the John Jay faculty, how would we teach that if we had full license to teach it any way we wanted, which I think we do anyway? But equally important, and perhaps more important, how you as students would want the material presented to you, how it should be packaged. What are your interests? How do you see these 2 things, performance and justice, coming together? And I wrote myself some notes that are so small that even an ant could not read them. So what I think I wrote is that there are taxonomies, certain different kinds of performance, a wide range, theater being only one of many. And there is also a really wide range of justice, or justices. And you know the T-shirt that we have around here, or the sign, you know, that there's social justice, and there's criminal justice, and there's environmental justice, and there's poetic justice, and there's, well, I could think of 30 more. Aristotle has a nice list in his book of ethics. But there are other kinds of justices that are perhaps in the 21st century. I know many of you who are students here at the college are practicing in human services, working in criminal justice, working in corrections, working in healthcare, or any number of other situations. And I think part of my job is to make sure that what's going on in the classroom is stimulating to you, not only intellectually, I think that's really important. But equally important, perhaps, is how it's stimulating to you in your day-to-day activities as you move through this educational process and begin to match it to your work, your actual day-to-day work, your interaction with human beings. So, and I wrote myself some other note here. There was who talked about making the invisible visible. I remember when I first came here, I don't know if anybody remembers Chris Suggs, John Christian Suggs, who used to chair our English department, and I think he was one of the first real acquaintances I made, and he said, well, there is no justice. And I think it was Lenny Bruce who said that only justice in the halls of justice happens in the halls. Both of these things lead me to believe that justice in and of itself is an invisible thing. We talk about it, but this is more visible, more physical than justice until we start to practice it. And then again, we may make some mistakes too. However, performance is visible in one way or another, and it's tangible. There are lots of ways in which we can describe performance, and there are people in the room who are more qualified than me to describe it. So I wanted to frame our discussion with some of these questions, and then I'm going to put one of you on the spot just to get the ball rolling. And that person already knows who she is.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Melinda? Because Melinda and I, with the help of Professor Lyle Davies and Melissa Wong, crafted a course proposal called Performance and Justice. And we're hoping that we'll be teaching this course soon. But maybe we can start with talking about how you might want to put together a lecture or a conversation with students here at John Jay about performance and justice. Is that a comfortable question?
Sure, yeah.
Great, great.
I'm not sure how comfortable I'll be with the microphone, but hopefully you all can hear me and the camera can as well. I think there's many ways to approach this idea of performance and justice, and I know in all of the classes that I currently teach, I'm always working in some aspect of performance, whether it be students putting together a small performance in class, some sort of small adaptation they do as group work that's centered around some sort of justice issue, or whether it be showing a performance that on video or on YouTube somewhere that intersects with some important ideas. So those are some of the kind of techniques. There's group works where students can actually put on their presentations. There's looking at performance and dissecting it, reading about it. But without going into the details and the nitty-gritty of the course that we worked on together with Melissa, who's here, and I don't think Lyle's here, but you know, what I would like to talk about is ways also of working possibly outside the classroom. For example, Ron Jenkins, who was on my panel yesterday, and who's here at the front row, took some of your students at Wesleyan, right, to work on prison theater. And I'd be interested in exploring some of those ideas here at John Jay as well. I can imagine it's quite a production to do that. I mean, just to get everybody checked in and their documents all checked in advance. And one of the great things about this conference is having somebody like Ron Jenkins here who we can ask about those procedures that he went through and explore those possibilities. Another idea I would love to explore would be the idea of working with John Jay students, but then going back to the high schools where they're from, or different high schools in the New York area. and working on, my specialization really is classical theater, ancient Greek theater in particular, and there's so many justice issues. I don't know if any of you, I'm sure quite a few of you have probably come across the play Euripides' Medea at some point. If you haven't, it's a good one to put on your reading list. But just the questions that play raises, for example, I think are really interesting. The justice issues that come between men and women, and what happens in the court system when relationships break up and there's children involved. All of these are issues that, or if we look at the play Oedipus, which is so much about identity issues and, you know, who are we and where are we from? These are issues I think that high school students are really interested in exploring, and I think it would be a great idea to have some sort of a connection, more of a connection between John Jay and various communities, although I can appreciate that it's difficult to figure out logistically.
Good. I'm going to just go around the panel a little bit, and then hopefully wheels are spinning in your minds, and we can informally take some questions. Shitra, I know that in the operas that you and I have participated in, they all happen to be in French. And the French have a term, juste, which is loaded with meaning. And I get a strong sense that the French opera has a bias. It tilts more in the direction of justice than, say, the German or the Italian. But may I ask you a broader question? Do you think that in the opera we're really dealing with issues of justice?
Okay, so I'm going to answer the narrow question because I can't let it go. I don't think French opera tilts towards justice. I think we've just performed those more. French opera, Italian opera focuses much more on justice because Verdi and Puccini were both obsessed by social justice and gender justice. And so almost all of Verdi and Puccini's operas have issues of class and race, no matter how you want to look at it. They always have characters that are drawn from periods in Italy where something unjust happened. So, but I'm going to answer this even more broadly. All dance dramas, and opera is dance drama, less dance in the Italian, certainly much more in the French for political reasons, have issues of social justice. I was thinking about this morning, terrified that I'd have nothing to say at this round table. I grew up with a lot of dance drama, but my family are all performers, and all the issues that are sort of played out are issues of justice, right? So pretty much anywhere in South India, and as a consequence Southeast Asia, those dance forms are heavily linked, have to do with issues of war, justice, gender, and so on. So I think almost all traditional performance, dance and dramas, were a way to convey problems of justice, be it Greek or classical Indian or 18th century Italian. But I don't think, and I have to think, it's an interesting question, I'm going to obsess about this all night. I don't think the French are better at it than anybody else. I think in a German opera it's its own other cup of tea, and there's so much involvement with German composers with fascism and Nazism that I think it's a different topic altogether, and one that'll take hours, but that in a nutshell is my response. So no and yes.
Thank you, and I can't stop humming the Ride of the Valkyries as we speak. I'm going to move on to Professor Malpede and ask one more question. And you guys, you can absolutely subvert the questions in any way that you want.
Good.
Karen and I taught a class which was improperly titled, called Drama Techniques in Crisis Intervention. But we were thinking more about conflict resolution, and then there's other terminology nowadays, conflict transformation. And we team taught, and we let the students create according to their own experiences. And I think that perhaps looking back on that class and on this term poetic justice, I'm curious whether teaching poetic justice is fair, because once again, if justice is so invisible, do we have to have these endings which wrap everything up and reward and punish according to good and evil? And how does that match with your classroom experience? Because I know you get students to write.
Yeah, so thank you for the last part of that. So I won't subvert the last part, and I'll ignore the first. No, there are two things I wanted to say really quickly. One is I'm teaching three classes, but I'll talk about two. They're intro to theater classes, and I decided to do two sections. One would be on it's called Writing Race, both RI and WRI. And then the second section is climate justice, which is what my new play is about. So we're just this is midterm, so we're finishing up the first section. So it was very fortunate for me because most of the students in both of the classes are of color, and they're like two white kids in the class, or one Sicilian like me, and one of the classes, so it's mainly a group of 30 in each class of students of color. And we started with James Baldwin's great play. Joan and I are great fans of James Baldwin. Blues for Mr. Charlie, and then we did Dutchman, and then we did Sister Sanji. Then we did a play that a student of mine wrote, who's just a little bit older than they are, called Tragedy in the Hoodsicle. It's been done, and it's in Shakespearean verse. The gentrifiers, the white gentrifiers, speak prose, and the people in the hood speak in Shakespearean verse. And it's a very sexualized language, as Shakespeare's language was. And then we did a play by Claire Koss, who's a white woman in her, an elder white woman, that was just done at the New Federal Theater, called Dr. Du Bois and Miss Ovington, and it's about Du Bois and a white woman, Miss Ovington, who were co-founders of the NAACP. So then I'm a believer that reading good work produces good writing. So I gave an option. You could write a play, you could write a monologue, you could start a play that you'll continue over the semester, or you could write a scholarly paper, or you could perform a scene from one of the plays we did. And students chose different people chose all of the above. But what always impresses me and really thrilled me was the quality of the writing of the plays. So that the scenes, the monologues, and also the scenes were just full of surprises. We talked a lot about the arc of a scene and reversal and recognition, and blah blah blah. And then yesterday, in one of these classes, kids were performing, and all of a sudden, a woman said, "We're really talented," and everybody said, "Yeah, we're really talented." And then somebody else said, "And we never get to talk about race outside of the hood, except here." And so for both of those reasons, I was very heartened. Okay, so there's that. The other thing, though, that I wanted to say is when you talk about performance and justice, I'm the only non-full-time person on this panel, and you will now know why. Because there's also activism. And just going back years ago, I taught at Smith College, and it was during pardon me? So it was during the anti-nuke movement, and Jonathan Schell just died, who was one of the great instigators of the anti-nuclear movement. And we took over the campus for a weekend, and we did a whole campus-wide ritual over the river, in the tunnels, underground, based on the myth of Demeter Persephone and the students' nuclear nightmare dreams. And so and also at Smith was the time of divestment in South Africa. And we took over the administration building, and those of us who were on the side of the students, were teaching our classes in the halls of the administration building where the administration could not come. And the upshot of that was shutting down the 5 colleges for a day-long teach-in about divestment in South Africa. So just to finish up, There is a new divestment movement around now. It's the 350.org, divesting from fossil fuels and trying to get organizations like the City University of New York to pull its money out of fossil fuel investment and put it somewhere sustainable. And this would be, and there's also an environmental justice minor being developed at John Jay. So I think there's a room for performance and activism as well.
Good, good. So now, Lucia, what I've noticed, Lucia, Lucia.
You were
What?
thinking Italian opera.
I was thinking Italian opera.
Yeah.
Well, at least we got the waltz of the Ride of the Valkyries out. No, anyway, what I've noticed is that in sociology, performance is taking a stronger seat than it has in the past. So the simple question, if you were to teach a course called Performance and Justice right here with our students here at John Jay, what comes to mind in terms of an approach?
I mean, so I'm going to answer a different question and then hope that it links
I'm
back,
sure.
Which is the first thing that you said I think is really true, which is that there's an increasing that more and more sociologists are recognizing that we need to use multiple genres to engage our students. And that performance, drama, music, whatever it may be, are actually really important ways to engage our students. And in introductions to then get them to talk about contemporary sociological phenomena. So last semester I taught a course on revenge, and we started with the Oresteia. I was incredibly nervous about that, given the fact that I had not read the Oresteia before that. But it really led into an incredible critique of the contemporary criminal justice system. So I think, to sort of link back to a question on performance and justice, that just the recognition that there are these alternative genres or ways of understanding the self can really contribute to how we help our students understand where performances are happening, right? So sort of what Dave was talking about today is that one of our jobs is to get our students to see that performance happens on theaters and on stages, but they also happen in interactions like this, in sort of more micro phenomenon. And I think to move from the large to the small is a really comfortable, natural, and pedagogically sound way to help students. Does that answer?
It's getting very warm. I don't know. I mean, because I don't know if there is an answer. We should explore.
Yeah.
I think we should explore.
I mean, I think the first question would be, what is performance?
Well,
right?
I know that that's a big question, and I know that there are many people here who have very clear understanding of that. And I think that it puts us under the microscope, as it were, as undergraduate instructors in particular, to be sure that A, we know all these taxonomies of performance, and B, that we can explain them to people who are just tasting it for the first time. And if Professor Carlson were on this panel, I could ask him a question, but first I'm going to ask Professor Brotherton a question. I'm going to, because I know that you testify in court time to time as an expert witness. And I can only imagine that everybody in that courtroom, you, the people that you're working, your clients, the people who are trying to do horrible things to them, the judges, the courtroom officers, are all engaged in some kind of performance. And I wonder what you've witnessed and how you might take that into an educational setting.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our students have personal experiences with the courts and with the justice system or the injustice system, or with family members. I mean, there's just, you ask anybody in his 32-member class who hasn't, and probably maybe one hand will go up, So we come from, that's the social class, that comes to our college. So for us to, put that experience in another critical perspective and light is, incredibly validating for our students, because a lot of the times our students feel wronged or feel confused about what's happening, and now, they yearn for some kind of critical analysis of, what they've themselves experienced. I've done 40, 50 trial, appeals. I mean, mostly in the immigration appeals court, stopping people being deported. And there were, as I've written about, terribly fraught experiences, situations. I mean, first of all, there's two lawyers, right? The government lawyer, and then there's the lawyer for the deportable alien, is what they call them. And before you go on, if it's just a civil case, you get prepped by the lawyer, especially if it's a homicide case. But this is not those sorts of things usually. And so you prep, so it's like rehearsing for a play, right? You got your lines, you know the themes, you know your answers, but you're being prepped by the friendly guy, and then the other horrible guy, person, their job is to discredit you, and sometimes to have you thrown out and to make you completely illegitimate. And so it's a very tense, emotional experience. They bring up all kinds of things. They bring up pictures of you, they bring up videos of you, they sling it in the folio, give it to the judge, they bring it up at the last minute, it's a curveball, you don't see it coming. They harass you, they harangue you. And sometimes, I don't even get into court. They telephone me. A lot of times these courts are in prisons. And a judge, if it's a particularly hard-nosed judge, they sometimes have my books in front of them. And they ask me what I wrote on page 232 and if I made a mistake on. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. They've even brought up drunk driving offences that I had in California. I can't believe that, can you? 20-something years ago. I mean, it just is. And it was something I said, well, I'm not on trial, Judge. Yes, I'm sorry. But the thing is, you are kind of on trial in a sense. I mean, the whole system's on trial. If you're sitting under, the big badge of America, and and it's got its logo. I mean, the whole thing. So that's really interesting for me to think in those terms. And the other thing is, the kind of all the actors in a courtroom, tons of plays on this anyway, but there's no play being written about deportation that I'm aware of. And I wrote about this in a piece called Exiling New Yorkers, and it's actually used a lot. A lot of my stuff is used by lawyers to write affidavits for their clients. And I was in Eastern Correctional Facility, which is a humongous facility, upstate a ways, and I have a court there, a deportation court. And usually these trials or these appeals go on for about 2 or 3 hours. This went on for 8 hours, and all the family of the deportee were there. There were about 25, 30 people in the family in the court, including his children, and his mother collapsed and had a heart attack on the floor when she was trying to testify. And they sent in the emergency management to revive her. The entire court was crying. Everybody was crying their eyes out. The correction officers were crying. The correction officers were running around with handkerchiefs, with paper tissues, giving them to people. I mean, it was complete chaos. I found it very. I was so drained at the end of it. I didn't know what I'd been through. Of course, not as drained as the poor bugger that was going to be deported. And that's an extreme case. But it's not so extreme. And I just remember, at the end of it, and the guy, the proceedings are being translated into Spanish. Even though the guy who's being deported had been living in the country like 16, 17 years or something ridiculous, and he was actually functionally literate, even though he graduated from university in Oklahoma. which maybe because she graduated. No, I should. But at the end of the appeals, you know, I was so, you know, completely, oh God, I don't know what I felt like. I just, it was sort of hopeless, really. And I said to the translator, I said, you know, is this, you know, and I'm so, you know, really, you know, I'm so glad I'm over this. I hope this doesn't happen very often. And she said, no, it actually happens all the time. And I'm, you know, the cruelty, right? The cruelty, the level of the normativeness of cruelty, and the sort of socialisation of people, so many people, you know, to put up with this cruel, very cruel, it's not just an unjust system, but a vindictive, cruel system that is utterly dehumanising. And for me, you know, to get back to your original question about what one does, you know, in our class, is to approach things of that nature. You know, I can't just start at first class saying this is a bloody cruel system, isn't it? You know, awful. Yeah, of course I can. But to bring that, to get that across to people about how dehumanising this system is, and on so many levels, and to validate those experiences of our pupils, I think personally that through a performance lens, you know, is in many respects it's so much easier to do than through a purely sociological lens or even a psychological lens. And then the other thing is, you know, if one were to teach this, one hopes, you know, we all can, is that it's not only sort of interdisciplinary, and usually we mean interdisciplinary to go like across the social sciences, we teach psych and so, but it's social science to humanities, isn't it? And a lot of our kids don't make those connections oftentimes. And this is a fantastic entree into that other way of seeing, right, of experiencing, and of thinking, and the fourth thing I think, which is, you know, should be the task of every educator, of transforming.
Can I ask a question? Sort of, because Dave and I've had some conversations about this. I also teach an immigration segment that focuses heavily on deportation that uses Dave's work in my intro class. And one of the conversations that Dave and I have had is about whether or not there are some performances like immigration court that is too much to take our students to. So initially I had a field trip planned to go to immigration court. I think I was in bed for 2 weeks afterwards, and wanted students to sort of get us to comprehend the magnitude of it, and then realize that there were actually several students in the class that were had different statuses themselves, that it could actually potentially be traumatizing. So I guess something to raise from Dave's experiences, what are those types of performances that are actually beneficial pedagogically for transformation versus are there types of performances that are too much, and how can we be responsible educators? Because we went back and forth a lot about that, about should I take them? I want to take them. Do they want to go? They want to go. But do we have the resources available if this gets really complicated afterwards?
I'm really curious what Shitra is thinking right now.
I want to ask the students the question. That's what I was thinking. So my classes here, and for those of you who don't know, they are master's students in psychology, psychology of victimization. About half the class is in their first semester in the MA program, and half the class their last semester. And so exposed fairly heavily to trauma and trauma theory and violence and abuse. Just the whole class is about violence. So I would actually like the class, if they want, you don't have to, answer Lucia's question. And then I'll tell you what I'm thinking, Seth.
Students, would you like to hear the question again?
Yes.
I think the question is what level of trauma you can take. Am I right? Basically?
In pedagogy performance, so
Yeah.
performance loosely defined. You can raise your hands and speak, or not raise your hands and speak.
I don't think we consciously are aware of what kind of trauma, like how it will impact us, whether, you know, we see things on TV and we hear about things and read about things, but
So you don't know what to expect until you actually get into the situation, whether the trial like the kind that David described.
Can I
So,
ask a quick question?
yeah, go right ahead.
This trauma you're describing as a psychologist, is that only that you break down? What if you become angry and want to participate? Is that also trauma, or is that becoming a participant in the drama unfolding?
Yeah. So, people respond differently. Some don't respond at all. Some get very upset with me personally for sending them on something that's upsetting. And then some get energized. My repeated experience has been that 95% get energized and 5% don't care or are pissed with me in some fashion. And they were pissed with me to begin with, and now it's an easy way to formalize a complaint. To answer Lucia's question, I'd rather the students answered it, but I'm going to answer it in lieu, and you can tell me if you think I'm right, is it touches so many different parts of you, right? So there's parts of you that become really energized and you want to act, and then there's parts of you that get really scared and shut down. Then there's parts of you that gloss over it because it's not quite relevant at that time, and so all of those become part of a larger component, and that's the experience of trauma. But it happens to everybody at every level. So I've been in the field for 15 years. I work almost exclusively with victims of rape, incest, and domestic violence. And there are still evenings where I just can't quite take it. And this is after scores and scores of clients and doing research and so on. And I think that's just the nature of confronting trauma. And everyone has a different way of dealing with it. And I actually think it's okay to break down. If you're breaking down every night, it's not. But if that particular night you don't do so well and you need 4 scotches over one, that's okay. And it's sort of part of also growing stronger. How would you integrate that into pedagogy responsibly is a bigger question.
Yeah. So, you know what? Just for the sake of the camera, let's bring the microphone out. Maybe if there's an ambassador here who can help us. Because we have another microphone here, which is just. Use this
While
one.
you're doing that, I just wanted to throw in 2 things to the conversation here, which is so interesting. One is, again, activism. To move students, I mean, I think of the deportation horror, and then the dream kids who are so brave, and are manifesting for the whole community. So I do think that that there is strength in community. And the other thing which doesn't answer the question at all, but the other thing I think is that there's great strength in beauty. And so going back to the Greeks, going to the great writers, balancing the actual trauma with the way that trauma has been written about, because trauma is the subject of writing most often. And that those 2 things, collective action and drawing strength from beauty, help. They don't,
Beauty is good.
So hi, I'm really enjoying this conversation. Hi everybody up there. I wanted to back. So my name's Joan Lipton, and I make theater with lots of different populations, often people who have been traumatized, including people with disabilities who are so marginalized and discarded, and all kinds of population, homeless youth and LGBT youth, which are sometimes the same. And I just want to offer a different way of thinking about breaking down, because it happens in our performances all the time. For us, we see the performance as a kind of prompt to the audience to then begin to witness their own experience. So we don't think of the post-show as a discrete, separate thing. We think of the conversation, just like we're having a conversation now, as an extension of the experience. And inevitably, because we've had so many performances, people, quote, break down. But I don't think of it as breaking down, guys. I just want to say that. I think of it as breaking open. We break open, we crack open and we reveal our own pain and our own vulnerability. And only when we do that can we find community and understand that there are other people who are going through the same thing. So the question becomes, Not so much that we break open or that, you know, we break down or we break open. The real question becomes, after that happens, what do we do? What do we do as teachers? What do we do as facilitators? What do we do as audience members? And I can just give you a quick example. I have so many of them, but one of them was we were doing a performance of our disability project, and as a fundraiser for a church, and there was a guy who saw us, and he had cerebral palsy, and he was gay, and he identified both of those things to the audience, and he started to cry. And that's a moment where it can be very scary for the audience, right? What do you do when that starts to happen? It's scary for the audience, it's scary for the performers, it's very scary for the facilitator. But he was crying because he'd never seen himself, and he'd never seen anything real about himself in a performative setting. And that's a really profound moment. It's like not a moment to be shied away from, and it's scary, but it's not wrong, you know? It's actually where you want to go in some ways. Not all the time. You want joy too, right? But you want to make that moment possible where people can start to tell you the truth about who they are. And so we said, you're not alone. There's a seat for you at the table. Would you like to come join us? And he came and he sat with, and it requires that as a facilitator you really be on your game and you try to read what's going on. But I just want to say one more thing, because we're so afraid of emotion. We're so repressed in our bodies, in our conversation, in our what we're willing to think and talk about. We surveil ourselves. We're not just being surveilled. We surveil ourselves. We censor ourselves. And what's important to me about community-based work, and the kind of work that you're talking about, is that it's a space that you can move outside that and get real and begin to heal in some ways when you tell the truth, when other people feel safe to tell the truth. So we need to not be afraid of emotion, but we need to think very creatively and healthily and productively about how we want to deal with it. Because of course when you go and you see people being abused, it's very upsetting. And you have to have a way of how to deal with that, right, after you experience it. So I just wanted to offer those thoughts.
That's really excellent. Caitlin will take the mic. I just wanted to quote my undergraduate advisor at Hunter College, Patricia Sternberg, who does a lot of work in children's theater, both theater for children and theater by children, and then creative dramatics, which is not necessarily for performance. But when she found out that I was doing this without having taken her class yet, she told me something I never forgot, which I try to practice. I don't say that I always do. She said, don't open a door that you can't close. And I think that if we're going to be facilitators of projects where we are exposing ourselves and our students to the traumas of others, that it's not over until you've managed to close that door. And if you don't feel up to the job, don't open the door. Because I think there are lots of ethical questions here about pedagogy. And again, I think Jay is the crucible to be talking about these things. Other things, Ron?
I think that's an important thing to remember about closing the door that you open, but that with that understood, I hope that you have a chance in this course about performance and justice to take students to court and perhaps to prison. My course where I take students at Wesleyan to prison is not called Performance and Justice, but it probably could be, because we learn a lot about justice in prison that we would never learn anywhere else. And Dante's poem, which we use as our text, is all about justice, but I never understood that poem as clearly as I do when I go in there, and my students go in there as well. I've worked in prisons, as I talked about on the panel, in Indonesia, in South Africa before apartheid was over, when people in prison were performing justice in a system where there was no justice, but inside prison they could create it. But here, and the situation in America is certainly different from that, but in some ways the same. The men and women that we meet in prison are very sophisticated. They understand that although nobody that I've ever met in 10 years of working in prisons has ever said, I'm innocent, I didn't do it. They admit what they did, why they're there. But they also understand that they're part of a system where there's a double standard. There's a justice apartheid, where there's two standards of justice for poor people of color and wealthy people who are white. And students from a college like Wesleyan who come there are very naive about that, and their eyes are opened to what Dante is all about, what justice is all about, what their society is all about, what our double standards are all about. So, just an example, a character like Ugolino from the 31st canto of Dante is a character that Dante's always asking you the question, well, do these people deserve to be in hell? What is justice? What isn't justice? Aren't they just like you? Aren't they just like me? Dante asks. And there was this one Ugolino, from the language that he used, I always thought he was protesting too much. He really did. He really ate his children, which is the question that is unanswered. Did he eat his children or not? At the end, you never know. Dante doesn't tell you. And I was sure that he did, because he was protesting too much and his language was too flowery. And I said, no, people don't talk like that if they're really innocent. And then the men in prison who I worked with told me, oh no. He said, I believe him, because that's the way you talk when nobody ever believes anything that you say. And these were men who had gone through their lives, branded as criminals, as convicts, whatever, and nobody ever believed anything they said. So they said that that's how you have to speak when nobody believes you. And that was a real lesson about justice, and one of the many.
Ron, could you talk a little more about the role that the students play in the classroom, or how exactly does it work when you take the students with you? Do you put on a performance together?
What we do is go in and it's a collaboration. My students from Wesleyan are collaborating with the incarcerated students on creating a theater piece. We start with Dante, but very much like the example that Ted gave about the Trojan women, Dante is just the jumping off point for people to identify with different characters and talk about their own stories. So in the end, we create a text that has Dante's text interwoven with the stories of the men or the women that we're working with. And then we put that on in the prison facility for an audience of incarcerated men or women. But what the next step, which is also a really important step, is that we take that text back to the university and perform it for the university and for the men and women who are inside who never get listened to and never believed when they talk to people. It's really important to have their voices heard outside of a prison. And then the discussions, and we've been doing it long enough that sometimes people who have been formerly incarcerated and worked with us inside are outside and performing with us outside, and then we have discussions with the audience, and all kinds of stereotypes are shattered because people don't expect to get the kind of wisdom and insight from people in prison that they do when they see a performance like that. So it works on many, many levels.
I'm curious, if you don't mind, if I just change gears a little bit and focus on a word that we're using a lot, but I think we all have a different understanding of what we mean when we say performance. And I remember in, what was that guy who was on the panel with you, Kevin? In Kevin's talk earlier today, he was rejecting the kind of criminology that resorts to abstract empiricism, where everything is reduced to numbers. But I also remember reading in a book authored by somebody in the room on performance that there are many times in which performance can be, the word itself can be used to refer to something like a high performance car, or a detergent. And therefore, it's also the case perhaps that the numbers themselves do perform. So maybe we ought to make some kind of collection of things that we think are performance when we're teaching justice and performance, because otherwise we're going to be all over the map. And for somebody like me, whose métier is theater, and then theater, and maybe a little opera, and then some more theater, I know there's a lot of other kinds of performance, which is why I'm so interested in your work. You know, for instance, you know, the woman crying because of the separation from her child. Obviously, this is directly from her inner self. But I also remember in the book, The Golden Bough, that funereal tears were a form of ritualized performance, and that people were often hired to cry at funerals. So I want us to think, hopefully out loud, what do we mean when we say performance, or what do you think when you hear us say performance? And I'm going to ask Melissa to help me a little bit, just a tiny bit. If you could say, do you distinguish between performance and performance art?
I have to think about this because it's such a, I think people in the discipline of performance studies, there you go, of course, I'm part of performance as well, will know that this is a question that cannot be answered in a few sentences. It's performativity, it's performance, there is theater as performance. Perhaps I want to think about, I think there has been in this conference perhaps a disagreement of what performance is, right? So is performance about everything? If performance is everything, then performance is nothing. So there's no political efficacy left in the word performance. And there's also a camp that believes that performance should only be relegated to artistic work, right? So we have to look at performance as just theater, performance art, dance, right? So I think that's a question that perhaps the round table can answer as well, right? So do you believe that performance, if performance can only be politically efficacious and credible if we relegate it to what it, you know, objects, right? Like theater, dance, and so on, or is the efficacy of performance, should we widen the definition of performance so that it can apply to other disciplines, which is, I think, what we're doing now, which is also, I think, what I am more inclined towards. Right?
Marvin wants to jump in, and then I know there's somebody up from the top. But Kate, can you give it to Professor Carlson, who's right in front of you?
Okay, first of all, full disclosure, I am the person that Seth keeps nodding at. I have written a book, actually 2 books, on performance. They've been translated into 14 languages, the 2 of them together. So probably this is as close to the word internationally as you will get. 2 or 3 things. One, Seth is absolutely right. It's a point that I make at the beginning of my book, that performance is one of these words like postmodernism that people use to do all kinds of work. And Seth's example is an excellent one, that we could say a high-performing car. And there's a whole range of things one can go through. Does this mean that performance ultimately is so broad that it means nothing? And I would say no, you just have to sort of locate where you are. And I do think there is a cluster of ideas which in fact are what this conference and similar gatherings are looking at. And I think I will attempt to very quickly articulate what these are. We're not talking about high performance cars. We're just not talking about that. There used to be a sign on the New York subways, some of you may remember, when the subways were celebrating their centennial, saying New York's longest running performance. The subways were performing. All right, we're not talking about that, however. We're really, and that, no question, that is a way that performance is used. But it is only asking for confusion to just try to take every way that anybody has ever used performance. It seems to me that what one most productively should focus on is the range of meanings of performance that have to do with human activity, for starts. Secondly, it is a particular kind of human activity. Not everything that we do is performance, although some people would argue that it is. And I would say, and again, this is my opinion, so you can, and obviously you could disagree with it, but I think it is helpful to think that what makes performance performance is a consciousness. That is, consciously produced behavior is potentially performative. Unconsciously produced behavior, like a sneeze, is not, unless you sneeze on purpose. Then it's performance. Similar, but there's another, that's half of a critical definition. It has to be consciously produced. But the other half is for something, for somebody. You do it for a reason. And again, and here's where this clarifies. It doesn't at all solve the problem of trauma, which is a very complicated and extremely open kind of area to investigate. I'm not even going to go into that, other than to say one of the ways of dealing with trauma is through performance, but that is through a conscious set of actions that are a strategy for dealing with the trauma. Just as within prison theater, there are certain strategies, but these are consciously produced acts for something. They are to do something, and again, it doesn't have to do anything with the degree of how much you're shocked by this or what the commitment is. And again, let me give you two examples. Let's say, example A Buddhist monk sets himself on fire. This is a performance. He's consciously decided to perform. I mean, it is a death. I mean, this is a serious performance. Performance doesn't have to be trivial. This is about as serious as you can get. Let's say, however, your neighbor is working his barbecue and sets himself on fire. That's not a performance. And it seems to me the distinction is perfectly clear here. And the monk immolates himself consciously in order to produce a certain effect. That's what performance is. Your neighbor who sets himself on fire is not performing. And I think if you just keep those two things in mind, it doesn't have to do with what the activity is. It doesn't have to do with how serious the activity is. It just has to do with the intentionality of the activity and the purpose of the activity. That's what really makes a performance.
That's terrific. Could I just add a couple of thoughts to that? One is going back to the undergraduate, or talking about undergraduates and trauma. It seems to me that one of the things we really want to produce in our students is a sense of agency. That they are in control of their own thoughts, that they are in control of their own actions, at least in the classroom, that this is a free space where they can be and be heard. So that's one thing. And the other is about performance, just to go a little further with acting, because George and I were talking about this last night, about acting being the performance of truth. And that the difference perhaps between performing or the immolation example that you gave is that actors revisit. So they revisit the same scene, the same line. George and I will be working on a play. 5 years later, he'll say to me, I just understood that line. He's been performing it beautifully for 5 years, but he's just been going deeper into a deeper truth. And so with acting, there's that returning and going deeper and repeating, which is another kind of I mean, you can perform something once, or, but there's also that kind of performance, which is.
Yeah, so I also want to go back to Marvin's, and I'm just so happy that I actually have my laptop in front of me, because it was so interesting what you said about like this distinction between performance that is a performance and that which is not a performance. And of course, like I think in this room I'm the only one who's getting, like I'm finishing with performance studies hopefully. So I got a degree in performance studies, which really is about everything is performance, as you pointed out. There are those who believe everything is performance, and then that's definitely the school where I'm coming from. But what I was wondering as I was listening to you, and you said some things are not performance, for instance, the neighbor setting his house on fire, was that maybe we should differentiate between the action itself, whether it is performance or not, or just what I was going to read to share with you. Actually, it's something that I've been working on, because this is really something that, in performance studies, we are trying to analyze everything as performance. And sometimes it's inevitable that you're just going to ask yourself, but why am I even doing this? So I'm actually quoting Diane Taylor, who is also in performance studies, and her starting point is theater too, but she takes it into other realms. When she says, so Diane Taylor says that focusing on sites and events, so not necessarily art performances, as performances allows the theories to construct the object of analysis, and I'm quoting her here, in a way that enables certain kinds of observations. So what I'm suggesting is that maybe we should differentiate between what's performance for those who are acting, so the agency, but what's performance for us analysts, what we want to analyze as performances. And maybe so what happens, and I don't know the answer obviously, but what happens if I, as an analyst or a theorist, choose to analyze both the neighbor who's setting his house on fire as a performance? So it's just like switching the perspective.
All right, yeah. Happily, Umberto Eco answered this question 30 years ago. It is, and his example is, let's say that the Salvation Army, this is his example, not mine. Let's say the Salvation Army finds a drunk out on the street, and they put him up on a platform, and they put a sign above him saying the evils of drink. And he's on the platform. Is he performing? And Umberto Eco says it depends on whether performance is an agency or a reception, which is exactly your question. He is not playing a drunk, he is a drunk. But he has, and Umberto Eco's term for this is ostentation. He has been ostended into, again, this is before we got into performance, so we were into semiotics then. And Umberto Eco says he's been made into a semiotic object. And you could say he's been made into a performing object. This is the other side of the coin. That is, if you're going at performance in terms of agency, then you must talk about a consciously produced act. But you can also, with equal validity, go to performance in terms of reception. That is, what makes what I'm doing right now performance? Is it the fact that I suddenly or consciously, and believe me, I do this all the time, think I'm performing? I'm dressed as a professor. I grow this beard because I'm performing. This is what I do. People, bums downtown say, "Hi, professor, got a quarter?" I'm in costume consciously, and I'm quite aware of that. But for a lot of you, perhaps you didn't think I was performing until I just said this. So your perception, it's a question of perception on both sides. If I take, and there have been a number of theater experiments that have done this. There's a wonderful example in Robert Wilshire's book about the phenomenology of theater, where he talks about a production back in the United States, in the New York Theater in 1995, called Light Touch by Wilton. Wilton just brought an audience like this into a warehouse with a a door down at the end, which had a curtain across it. He pulled the curtain across, opened the door, and outside was the street. That's what was outside. And Wilshire, he's writing for this from a phenomenological point of view, said it was as though the street had been transformed. I was seeing cars as if I was seeing them for the first time. Were the cars performing? Well, in Seth's sense, yes. But the cars were not performing, but they had been framed in a performative way so that we could view them, and we were encouraged to view them as performance. So you're quite right, but that is the other side of the picture. Both, and performance can be gone at either way, but they're not the same.
Yes, but can I just quickly respond? Because the reason why I find it fascinating that you bring up Umberto Eco, because sometimes he uses this argument to sort of argue with his interpreters, but sometimes when he really disagrees with someone who read his work and provides certain interpretations. So that's why I think it's such an interesting point that you're raising about where does performance start and where do we allow certain interpretations to start. And it kind of goes back to trauma, actually, because so much of when it comes to when we're trying to bring together performance and trauma, so much of it, the lack of agency or the lack of consciousness or lack of intentionality. So where do we draw this line? And I'm just putting out the questions. I don't have the answer, but it's so interesting that Echo, when he starts to make this argument, he's really passionate.
I won't go on a link. Here is the answer.
Yes.
The answer is with consciousness.
Okay.
The answer is with consciousness. Trauma is not performance, but trauma, when you become conscious of it as an activity or as an emotional state, or when you begin to unpack it and act it, then it becomes performance. The trauma itself is not performance. That's why trauma is so interesting to performance theorists, because it's not performance.
I'm curious if you could give Caitlin the mic. Nathaniel, if you don't mind a question, I've been thinking as I'm listening to this conversation, maybe I'm listening to you think. Because earlier today, Nathaniel was speaking about the play Zooman and the Sign by Charles Fuller. And I know that you ran out of time and took 3 pages away. And thank you. But nonetheless, how does what you're hearing play into the way the sign in Zooman and the Sign functions as agency? Is the sign performing, or is the father of the murdered girl more important than the sign? I know.
I really do not, I'm not trying to equivocate here, but if I could just sort of think about this a bit more, because I mean, the whole dynamic is very, very interesting to me. Just trying to think about performance and what it really means and how you take it in. Because I think one of the serious problems with it, this is something I've thought about, is you have to sort of be able to give it some type of definition. And we haven't found yet how to give it a definition. And when I speak of definition, I don't know if you mean, I don't know if I mean denotative or connotative, but there has to be some type of limit. And the limitations have not been put on performance. So that's why it's so vague, and that's why it's so difficult to really understand exactly what it means. So I'm just taking it in. So if I can avoid not answering your question, I will. Okay?
I'll ask you again in a year.
No, but I mean, it's fascinating. It really is, because I mean, if you're in theater, you sort of have a sense of what performance is, particularly something on stage. And I'm sort of wrestling with the question right now: can you have performance without having an audience? That's something I've been thinking about just as I'm sitting here thinking now.
No, I was thinking about that too. I was thinking about whether prayer is a form.
Yeah, it's like those are the kind of issues.
And of course, that would open up a whole bunch of questions about belief systems.
God is the
But even if there were no God, or in spite of people's belief that there is a God, people pray with intentionality. And if there's no receiver, is that prayer performance? I'm not necessarily looking for an answer, but I understand the troubling nature of these kinds of questions. And I think it especially interesting in Zoom Man and the Sign or Genet's Play the Screens, how there's an oscillation, because anyway it's a play, anyway it's a performance. But then components in that performance, you know, I mean, there's this famous Grotowski piece called Acropolis, and there's a wheelbarrow in which they carry around the people who are about to be incinerated in the concentration camps. And that wheelbarrow has a performative nature in and of itself. And then when the theater team tried to move the wheelbarrow from one country to the next, it always presented problems. At every airport they took that wheelbarrow to. So the wheelbarrow in some weird way started performing outside the context of the play. So the ways in which objects perform, it fascinates me, and yet it may be antithetical to some of the things that we would be teaching in classes where we're asking students to do projects where they get up on their feet and interact with other people. And I'm asking these questions maybe more for myself than for anybody else, because I'm trying to draw a circle around what I would successfully be able to teach in a 300 or 200 level undergraduate classroom, and what you guys would want to learn. Like maybe some of you are graduate students, but you may remember when, and I see some undergraduates out there.
So can I go,
Yeah.
but pre-object
Pre-object, go there.
audience, and maybe this is where the social sciences can be helpful, because your example of praying, I was thinking actually of the example of the guy who goes out, not the drunk, the guy who goes out and lights something on fire, right, because he's trying to barbecue. So maybe he's not performing lighting something on fire, but is he performing some type of masculinity by going out and cooking, right? I mean, these are things that sociologists really think about, is what do these practices mean in terms of performances? And I think with audiences, you don't have to have a physical audience, or a sociologist would say, you don't have to have a physical audience, but you have some type of imaginary audience of you know, what a man, what people, what dominant culture, what a sort of hegemonic culture, whatever language we want to use, is that we have these ideological formations that are the sort of phantom audience, even when we're in our homes acting. You know, it's why people who on Sundays, some people who live alone feel bad about being in their pajamas, right? It's because there's some notion that you should get out of your pajamas every day, right? I mean, that you should get dressed, and I know everybody looks horrified because we're in New York City, but you know, I was taught you always get out of your pajamas, right? What does it matter? Who sees it? What does it matter? But it's about construction of the self, and it's about a performance for a person, a performing identity. You're a productive member of society. Nobody's going to see it, but there is an audience, there is a world that's shaping that.
In that example, though, there is a lack of consciousness. In other words, if you're performing masculinity, whatever that is, you're trapped in a stereotype that you think you should perform. Whereas in performance, like George and I went to see a really terrible play, which will remain nameless, and we came out, as you always do, having less energy than you ever had before, and you have to reboot yourself. So we got home, and the last 15 minutes of Tosca was on from the Met, and I was totally entranced because I suddenly saw what performance is, and I said to George, look, things are happening between people. So the stakes are high, it matters, you know, everything matters. And then he said, and it's also happening inside of them at the same time that it's happening between them. And when you see a really great piece of art, that is what you're caught up in. That what's going on inside and what's going on between, and how those are changing, which is very different, it seems, than, so George wants to get in here.
Kate's coming, George.
Hi, my name is George Matanyev, and I've been a performer most of my life, and also run theaters. And also now I teach very happily at the same time. And it seems to me we're drifting away from the point of this discussion, which is what kind of a definition of performance is most appropriate in this context that you're trying to define. And it seems to me, from my own experience and from listening to people like Ron Jenkinson and people who work outside in the fields, the various fields of theater with communities, creating pieces, that performance in this context has to be about people interacting and learning the structure of performance and what it means, because all performance has something to say that eventually the group, whether it be one student or 2 or 5, learn to say together. And that is the experience that they seem to get the most out of, because in the end, whether they create the piece themselves or with the help of a facilitator or whatever, that is the experience that ignites them. And I think the most important thing about performance is that it ignites the performer as well as the audience in some essential way that has something to say to both. Both parties learn from the experience of arriving at performance. And that process is the most important process of all. The creative process that you go through, that you suffer through, and eventually are liberated by performance. That is the most precious definition of performance in a context of young people who come to theater as a completely new and totally virgin experience of art. I mean, it's really extraordinary that theater is being taught here. I think it's fantastic, but it needs to, accept that you have to hand on that experience to them and let them have that.
And they all propose, so one guy in education, one guy in theater, many people in poetry, many people in art, visual arts, that it should be what they call participatory art. So they said, we are not artists, we are proposers, and there is no public or audience anymore, there are participants. So when I think this critique has not been assimilated as it should internationally. And I still think it's very relevant. I guarantee MoMA is going to do a show on Lisha Clark very soon. I guarantee everyone will call it performance. I can tell you, in 1956, do not call it performance. This is not performance, because I'm working against this kind of power structure, as Augusto Boal, as Paulo Freire, as Augusto de Campos, and so on. And I think it's a historical note that's important.
I thank you very much. I think that in the name of performance, there's going to be one here tonight, and I know that the artists have to come in here, they have to get ready, and not only that the people who are running the camera, they have to leave, and that what would be really cool is that we have a beginning, we had a really good middle. Are you ready for the end? I want to thank everybody very much for your thoughtful contributions. Thank you so much.